Our body is always in flux. When we are cold, our body shivers. When we are hot, our body sweats. Our body engages in these activities to keep our internal temperature constant. This is an example of homeostasis.
Homeostasis.
The ability of the body to maintain a constant internal state. One major way the body maintains homeostasis is through the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a system of glands that produce hormones to regulate and control bodily activities. The endocrine system controls a number of important functions throughout the body, including growth and development, metabolism, and homeostasis.
Homeostasis.
There are many different hormones in the body, and each is responsible for different functions. Estradiol, testosterone, insulin, growth hormone, and epinephrine are just a few examples of hormones. Although they are involved in different functions of the endocrine system, hormones work in a similar manner. First, a gland detects a change in the body's internal environment. This gland then increases the secretion of hormones, which enter the bloodstream. Hormones travel through the blood and can have potential effects throughout the body. However, hormones will not act on every cell. Hormones activate target cells by binding to specific receptors on the inside or outside of the target cells. When a hormone binds to a receptor, the receptor sends a signal throughout the cell. Just like a megaphone amplifies the volume of a person's voice, a hormone's message is amplified inside the cell. This signal goes a long way. Just a few hormones can induce great change. Once hormones have succeeded in sending their message to their target cells, and in this case, homeostasis is achieved, the gland decreases the secretion of hormones. The mechanism by which the gland stops secreting hormones is called negative feedback. What exactly is negative feedback? Negative feedback allows a system to self-regulate a response or output. The following example may help explain. A house regulates temperature using negative feedback. When the thermostat detects a decrease in temperature, it sends a message to the furnace to produce heat. When the thermostat detects that the room temperature has returned to the correct level, it stops sending its message to the furnace. A furnace will turn on and off several times a day to keep the temperature relatively constant. Now let's look at a specific example of homeostasis using a hormone many of you may have already heard of: insulin. Let's say a person eats a meal. As the food is digested and glucose is absorbed into the bloodstream, blood glucose levels begin to rise. It is important for this glucose to be removed from the blood, otherwise it may cause damage to important organs such as the liver, brain, and kidneys. Thus, to maintain blood glucose levels, insulin is released from an endocrine gland, the pancreas. The pancreas senses increased blood glucose and releases insulin into the blood. Insulin travels through the blood and binds to receptors in muscles, fat tissue, and as shown here, the liver. Upon binding to receptors, insulin causes an increase in glucose transporters, allowing excess glucose to be taken from the blood and stored in the liver for future use. This uptake of glucose by the liver and other organs for storage restores blood glucose levels to a balanced state. Homeostasis has been achieved. Because blood glucose levels have reached homeostasis, the pancreas will stop secreting insulin. This is just one type of hormone involved in the endocrine system. Remember, glands of the endocrine system send messages to the body in a similar manner. A gland senses a change in the body and secretes a hormone. Hormones travel through the blood. Hormones are receptor specific. A hormone signal is amplified. And finally, hormones are regulated by feedback, many times negative feedback.
So we're going to be talking about the endocrine system. An endocrine system is the sum of the hormone secreting cells and tissues that's within an organism. Why are we talking about this now? Well, we've been talking about mitosis and cell division, but we've also been talking about cellular communication. And we've made a small connection between how the body system is going to talk to the cells to let them know when it's time to either go through apoptosis, planned cell death, or when the body's going to tell the cells to go through mitosis, when it needs to repair a tissue, or when you are going through growth. Both your endocrine and your nervous system play a role in coordinating and controlling your body's responses to stimuli. The endocrine system oftentimes uses hormones, which are communicating molecules, in order to send the signal throughout your body. And that's called endocrine signaling, which we've talked about. The endocrine hormones are typically released through endocrine glands, which are ductless organs throughout your body. Most of the major endocrine glands are located in this diagram. So just to repeat, the endocrine glands release hormones. Those hormones are actually ligands for receptor proteins on the surface of target cells. When the hormones stop being released, the ligands stop binding and the target cells stop responding. That is called negative feedback. In some cases, there's a positive feedback where the initiation of a process actually creates an amplification of that same process. So the product that's being produced at the end of it encourages more signaling, and it ramps up and it gets more and more and more intense. We'll talk about an example of this. Oftentimes, your body will actually use neuroendocrine signaling, which is a mixture of both the nervous system and the endocrine system working together. Most often, this is mediated by the hypothalamus, which is located within your brain, within the animal parts of your brain. So there's an old part of your brain, which has a tendency to mediate any processes that has to do with your survival. And then there's the new parts of your brain, which have to do with deeper, greater thinking and complex social structure. So in this deep, dark animal part of your brain is located the hypothalamus. So let's say that you get cold. A sensory neuron is going to determine a drop in temperature. It's going to send a signal to the hypothalamus, which is going to secrete thyrotropin, also known as TRH. And it's going to secrete that hormone into your blood vessels. At the same time, the anterior pituitary, which is also located in that deep animal brain, is going to release thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. These two hormones working together are going to then increase the cellular metabolism, and that's also going to cause shivering. Those two processes are going to allow you to have enough energy for your cells to continue to, for your muscles to continue to shiver. And then you're going to be able to develop the friction that is going to warm up your body. Once your body is warm, the sensory neuron is no longer going to be getting the cold stimulus. And so the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary are going to stop releasing their hormones. The duodenum, or the duodenum, is the upper part of your small intestines that leads straight into your stomach. Underneath the duodenum, or the duodenum, is the pancreas. So if you have a low pH in your duodenum, the S cells of the duodenum secrete a molecule called secretin. And this travels to the pancreas, where it hits onto target cells. And those target cells have stored vesicles of bicarbonate, which then neutralize the acid. So the pancreas then releases the bicarbonate, it neutralizes the acid, the pH raises in the duodenum, and so you no longer have the stimulus. Once again, negative feedback where the response stops the stimulus and then the process stops once it achieves homeostasis. Now, I know that when I was talking about hormones, when we were doing the biomolecule unit, I told you that steroids have a tendency to look like these honeycomb structures, and that they are lipid soluble because they are nonpolar. So although that is absolutely accurate, I also didn't tell you that sometimes some hormones are water soluble and polar molecules. So insulin is a polypeptide. We know that peptides have a tendency to have an amine group on one side and a carboxylic acid on the other side, which means that they're going to be polar, and that means they're also going to be water soluble. Epinephrine is also an example of a water soluble hormone. I may have kind of jumped ahead of myself by saying words like target cells. So if you remember, hormones are oftentimes released into your blood vessels or into just your intercellular fluids. And so then they travel all around your body. Now, all of your cells aren't going to respond to the signal the same way, and sometimes cells aren't going to respond at all. You don't need your eyeball to respond to a human growth hormone. You don't want your eyeball to start growing disproportionately, right? So you're going to have specific target cells that will have the surface receptors that can actually respond to the appropriate hormone. If that cell doesn't need to respond to that hormone, it just won't make the receptors for it. Now, not all receptors are surface receptors. Sometimes, if you remember, those nonpolar hormones are able to move into the cell itself, and so there's intracellular receptors. And oftentimes, the cellular responses aren't only mitigated by the nucleus. Sometimes the cellular responses just happen within the cytoplasm. Like in the last case that I was talking about, and the pancreas releases the stored vesicles of bicarbonate. That didn't have to go to the nucleus. So I just want you to keep that in mind. I also want you to know that there's a difference between tropic hormones and sex hormones. So tropic hormones are pretty much any hormone that doesn't have to do with sex or creating the different secondary sexual characteristics between males and females. So just to remind you, endocrine signaling is when you typically have gland cells or cells within these ductless organs release molecules that travel all over your body. Paracrine signaling is usually close by, so you have these cells that are going to secrete ligands or communication molecules, but they're going to do that only close to where the response needs to happen within the organism. You have autocrine signaling as well, where sometimes those same paracrine signaling cells will actually talk to themselves and initiate responses within the paracrine signaling cell itself. We talked about synaptic signaling, and synaptic signaling is kind of like a type of paracrine signaling, right? Because you have these signaling molecules, these neurotransmitters, the primary one being acetylcholine, which you'll need to know, which is released into the synaptic cleft in between either two neurons or between the neuron and a response cell. Now, the new thing that we introduced in this lecture is that neuroendocrine signaling. So I want you to remember that sometimes you have a neurosecretory cell, which is going to perhaps release another neurotransmitter, which is not acetylcholine. And that will then act as an initiator of a hormonal response. Or perhaps it will just release that ligand into the bloodstream where it can travel all over the body to different target cells. We have to think that this process is very, very delicate, and these communications have to happen in a very sequential order for things like metamorphosis to occur. For that caterpillar to go through the entire pupation process, you have to remember that the way that the communications are let out has to tell the body in a step-by-step manner exactly what it needs to do. So these are very, very delicate processes, and so they have been very refined over time. I am now going to focus on several key hormones, and some of your cellular responses. So we've actually already talked about this one, but I wanted to bring it up again before you take your exam. Epinephrine, if you remember, is released by the adrenal gland, and it's a type of adrenaline. And so you guys have heard of EpiPens. Well, epinephrine is what's inside of an EpiPen. And so pretty much it's adrenaline, and it's released into your bloodstream, and it has a lot of very quick responses. So you have to think about, okay, well, when is adrenaline going to be released? Adrenaline is going to be released when you are faced with a tiger, or when you think that somebody's going to hurt you, right? So you're initially going to have to deal with this fight or flight response. And so how is your body going to get prepared for that? Well, on a cellular level, the epinephrine is going to surge throughout your entire body really quickly. So different cells need to respond to this stimulus differently. But in a lot of these cells, no matter how they're going to respond, the epinephrine is going to bind to a receptor protein, in this case, a G-coupled protein receptor, which, if you remember, then activates the G protein, which then activates adenylyl cyclase, which turns ATP into cyclic AMP, or into a CAMP molecule. Now, if you remember correctly, that secondary messenger can then activate several different amplification processes within the cell in the transduction portion of cellular response. In this case, it's going to initiate the inhibition or the deactivation of glycogen synthesis, and it's going to promote glycogen breakdown. So why would this be important? Well, glycogen is how we store glucose within our cells. And so we don't want to store the glucose. We want to promote the breakdown of glycogen back into glucose. So we have a lot of energy for our mitochondria to create ATP, because I'm either going to have to fight or I'm going to have to flight. And that means I'm going to need a lot of energy available for my body. In other parts of your body, you're going to have that epinephrine bind to beta receptors, and you're going to see some different responses. So you might see the same receptors on the outside of cells, but because the cells have different jobs, then you're going to actually get a different response. So for instance, the beta receptor in skeletal muscle is going to cause the vessel to dilate so that you get more blood flow to your muscles, so that you have a better chance of running away. And then at the same time, that same epinephrine is going to bind to an alpha receptor, which is very similar, and it's going to bind to the intestinal blood vessels, and it's going to shrink them or constrict those blood vessels, because you don't want to worry about digesting your food when a tiger's chasing you. You want to worry about running away. So your skeletal muscle blood vessels are going to dilate so that more blood flow gets to them. At the same time, your intestinal blood vessels are going to constrict because they're not really necessary at that moment. Another important set of responses that you need to know and understand are how your body maintains homeostasis for blood glucose level. So if there's too much glucose in the blood, it can be damaging to your organs. And so your body has to really maintain a very steady state of blood glucose. So what happens when you pick up a donut, right? So if you pick up a donut, you're going to have a different response inside of your blood. Your blood has to get that glucose out of your body has to get the glucose out of your blood and get that glucose stored away so that the glucose can't damage your other organs. However, when you haven't eaten for a while and your blood glucose level starts to drop, then you've got to increase the concentration of glucose within your blood so that you have enough glucose for cellular respiration. So when you have low blood glucose, your pancreas is going to secrete this chemical called glucagon. And the glucagon is going to enter into your blood vessels. It's going to hit the target cells within your liver, and your liver stores glycogen. So it's going to promote glycogen breakdown, and the glucose is released into the blood. The blood glucose level rises, you no longer have the stimulus, so that negative feedback response means that then the pancreas is going to stop secreting the glucagon. Oh. Okay, when your body eats the donut and your blood glucose level rises, your pancreas releases insulin into the blood. What that does is it makes the certain target cells within your body, it initiates proteins to be inserted into the cell membrane that pump the glucose into the cell. And it also stimulates the liver to take up the glucose and store it as glycogen. Then the blood glucose level decreases and you're back at homeostasis, which is about 90 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood. I talked a little bit earlier about this old ancient part of your brain. So here's your brain stem, here's the cerebellum, and this is where you're going to find the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and then the pituitary gland. So these ancient glands, all of this is going to release chemicals into your body that are going to mediate or moderate very important processes for survival. For example, the posterior pituitary gland is responsible for releasing ADH, which helps it's an antidiuretic hormone. So what that does is it keeps the amount of water and osmoregularity in your blood. And then it also moderates oxytocin, which is important for survival because that controls our mammary glands, our uterine muscles, and forming the basic social bonds. So antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, is also known as vasopressin. And what that can do is it decreases urine production when your osmoregularity or when your tonicity in your blood gets too high. So if you have high blood osmotic pressure, it stimulates the hypothalamus, which creates these it creates more aquaporins within the nephrons inside of your kidneys. And what that does is it allows more water to move out of your kidneys and back into your blood. So if you had water, say, stored in your bladder, or if you had more water inside of your kidneys, then what it would do is it would create these aquaporins, so the water would move out into your blood, so that hopefully that water would move into the saltiness of your blood, and it would create it would dilute your blood to the point where you were back into homeostasis. So when you get dehydrated, that's when ADH is released. When you're overhydrated, ADH is going to be inhibited, and that's going to cause the movement of water back into the nephrons in your kidneys and back into your bladder. So it would store that water away into your bladder. Now, I know we've talked about oxytocin as it relates to labor and the pressure of the baby's head on the cervix and how that causes the release of the oxytocin, which causes contractions, which causes the baby to put more pressure. And I told you that's a positive feedback mechanism. Oxytocin is also responsible for bonding with babies, but it's also responsible for helping females to produce milk. And so the baby, if the baby suckles on the breast, that's the stimulus. It's going to go through a sensory neuron to the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. Then it's going to secrete the oxytocin into your blood vessels. The smooth muscles in your breast are going to be the target cells, and that's going to cause the dropping of the milk or the release of the milk from the vesicles within those smooth muscle mammary gland, the mammary glands beneath the smooth muscles in your breasts. So what are the take-homes? Hormones are signaling molecules that move throughout your body. Although cells might have the same receptors, They might have different jobs, so you might get different responses even in the same surface receptors on the cell. Sometimes the receptors are different, and so you have the same hormone, but you have different receptors on different cells that are also going to do different jobs. You can have positive feedback mechanisms and negative feedback mechanisms where the response is going to increase the amplification of the signal, and that's positive feedback, or if it stops the signal, then that's negative feedback. You should know what ADH is, how it works. You should know what's the difference between insulin and glucagon and in what conditions those are released. And you should know the oxytocin as an example of a positive feedback mechanism. Last but not least, you should know that a gland is a ductless organ within your body. And I hope that I've helped you understand a little bit better about the communication molecules in your endocrine system.